Okay, so welcome to another Future Orchards virtual orchard walk. Well, not quite virtual because you'll be getting out into the field later on, but poor old Craig and I are stuck here in New Zealand and can't be with you. And we apologise for that. We hope that this pandemic will stop and we can get back to being there in person, but we'll do the best that we can virtually. So today's talk that we'd like to talk about is the lessons that we've learned. Let's take the positives out of this pandemic and let's look at a vision of improvement going forward. So as way of introduction, what are the COVID-19 pandemic lessons that we've learned? And you know, we will be using a lot of our New Zealand experience and hoping that relates to Australia, but the two countries are slightly different, but I'm sure there's a lot of cross learnings here. So, you know, learning number one is our business currently relies on fit, strong migrant labor whose supply is politically influenced and it's often in short supply. We've learned that there's a shortage of people capable of heavy physical work, and Craig will demonstrate just how physical the role, particularly of harvest, really is. And we've also learned that there's a shortage of skilled people, particularly people that can handle complex trees. And so these are the lessons. And then what are the three major lessons that we've learned? And we'd boil it down into the three biggest challenges that the apple and pear business faces going forward are: number one, labor; number two, labor; and number three, labor. So you know, it's the pandemic has just reinforced. We knew this was a challenge. We spent quite a bit of time, but the pandemic has just brought it to an absolute another level. And so we're bringing to you the concept that we have to change. We can't keep doing what we've been doing, and the pandemic has been the catalyst to force change at a much faster pace.
So, you know, this is a typical scene in the middle of winter when we've just got heaps of ladders and people at height and everything else, and the amount of just work and unproductive work ladders can bring. And so we have to change this reality. And you've seen the slide before, you know, and you've got to think about this. If we're climbing up and down ladders per hectare, we're talking at harvest just around 4,000 meters of climbing, and base camp to Everest is about 3.5 meters of climbing. And if you want to add in thinning and pruning and the different passes that go through an orchard during a season, it's sea level to the top of Everest. And if I can play the video, and if we just look also, if you look at this analysis in a totally different way, and you just look at picking a bin of apples, and you're going through this, the same analysis occurs that to fill this bin, they climb ladders 22 times. And for 190 bins a hectare, that's about 6,000 meters of climbing. So it's just another example about how we've got to do that every time they're climbing. And it's actually unproductive work. All the walking is unproductive. The other way to look at this whole physical thing is, I was just trying to think, is saying, how physical is this? You know, it's a really demanding process, and the type of people we need in our workforce are amazing. So, you know, if we just thought about one bin's 400 kilos approximately, we're asking them to do 4 bins a day, 1,600 kilos per day. If we're working just 5 days a week, not 6 or 7, 8,000 kilos a week. And if we can stretch out and we've got a good mix of varieties and we can get a full 12 weeks a season, it's 100 tons we're asking that individual to shift during the season. It's a little bit less than a blue whale. A blue whale is about 135 tonnes. So it's a hell of a lot of fruit that we're asking these people to shift, and it's very physical. So again, we have to change the dynamic.
So we've said, okay, take the lessons of the pandemic, take the facts that Craig's just laid out, and let's specify what the labour objectives need to be going forward. And we've brought it down to 4. And that is, we need to get the job done on time, and to a good standard. We've got real problems this year in New Zealand. I understand there's problems in Australia too. Just getting the job done, just finding the people to get the job done is an almighty challenge. We need to reduce the labour cost per kilo, which means we need to spend less hours per kilo. We're both in countries that have very high labour costs per hour. And so us as fruit growers in Australia and New Zealand needs an objective to reduce the labour cost per kilo. Our orchards must be workable by a greater demographic of staff. You know, there's no way that most people can pick the weight of a blue whale in a season, and certainly can't pick it climbing ladders with a 20-kilo bag around their neck. The number of people that are physically capable of doing that is quite small. So we need our orchards that can employ a greater demographic of staff. In apple orchards, it would be a great objective if we could all work towards the objective that apple orchardists become employers of choice. People want to come and work for us to earn good money, and all the rest of it goes with it, rather than being employers of last resort.
So it becomes about getting the job done is number one. And thinking about this, most of the growers I talk to, that in the last 5 years, they've been talking about the economics and the cost of getting a job. But through the pandemic, and especially leading into this current harvest, it's just about getting the job done. How do I get it? And the cost is secondary. Not that it's not important, but it's just more important to try and get it done. And if we're trying to get the job done, can we get more people? Highly unlikely. Maybe we can shift into a wider demographic, but it's difficult. And again, we have to squeeze and we have to try and improve our efficiency. And there's possible gains there, but we have to look at this in both perspectives. If we look at it, just looking at the metrics and what this is about, and we look at getting the job done, and these are the numbers, the average figure out of the the last OBA analysis we've done. We're spending $22,000 a hectare on labour. And if we convert that at an average hourly rate, it's about just short of 1,000 hours a hectare. And you look at that and you're saying, so is ours something we should look at over time? But then if you look at it on a tonne basis, you're sort of saying the different tasks you've got in there, harvesting 7.3 hours per tonne. And we've got to think about these efficiency points. And no matter what we look at, pruning and thinning, we have a quite a length of time to get those tasks done. It's not as time critical, but when we come to harvest, it's our highest labour demand. It's where we spend the most time, but it's also time and fruit quality dependent. So it's actually a really critical point. So a lot of focus has to be around harvest. There's also some significant labour going into other wages, which could be young blocks, tree training, all sorts of other issues around the orchard, spraying and mowing and those sorts of things. So we come up with 21 tonnes, close to 22 hours per tonne. If we just look at shifting our yield, so we actually just get more efficient by increasing our yield factor, and we take it from the average around 48 tonnes a hectare and we lift up to 65 tonnes, we get some efficiency gains in terms of our cost structure, especially in terms of dollars per gross kilo. But really the demand for harvest labour remains, so it's still where the real focus needs to be. There is always some gains with yield, but the real thing is we have to look for genuine efficiencies across the board. when we're measuring efficiency and we're looking at it, and if you look at other countries, we need to think about this one in terms of Chile has had in the past relatively low labor costs. So they're quite comfortable spending 1,200 hours on a crop of 50 tonnes and getting maybe only about a 55% pack out. So their figures look pretty poor, but their cost has been relatively similar to New Zealand's. And when you look at New Zealand, Italy, and Australia, they're actually very similar numbers. And the difference between them is the yield. New Zealand sitting at about 58 tonnes, Italy just over 60, and Australia at about that 48 mark. So when you look at hours per tonne, there's definitely some efficiency gains if we can study what's happening in New Zealand and Italy. And when you look at the harvest point, Australia seems to be doing pretty well around that. New Zealand a little bit poorer, but it could be a little bit about how we're actually collecting the data around the full cost of picking, but very similar in Chile quite a way behind in terms of harvest efficiency. So if we just take that Italian example and we break it down and we look at it a little bit differently, you know, if you look at hours per hectare, you think, oh, the harvesting labour for Australia looks quite good, but the real difference here is actually Australia sitting at an average of 48 tonnes and Italy sitting at about 65. And when you look at this hours per tonne, they're very radically different, even though the harvesting labour is still not bad for Australia. We've got other significant changes in terms of pruning and thinning, where Italy's doing much, much better in terms of that labour demand and in other wages. And when you look at tree structure and everything else, my summary in terms of what's really driving this is variety mix has an impact in terms of driving yield and that. Italy, people just there's no ladders in Italy in their orchards. And when I question people, surely there's ladders there. The growers and say, look, there might be one ladder sitting around the farm, and that's to clean the gutters on the house or the shed, but they don't use ladders in their orchard at all. Their orchards and their tree structures are simple. They have really relatively low vigor compared to a lot of the other canopies that I look at around the world. It's a relatively high yield, and they have a lot of experience with platforms and working without ladders, which is a really big efficiency gain in itself. So if we think about lowering this labour demand and increasing efficiency, one thing that we want to keep reinforcing is we need to absolutely have consistent high yield because that creates efficiency in labour itself. We have to have simple trees that are open, have high colour, and we know that these simple canopies in our studies can increase picker efficiency with easy access between 25 and 50%, depending on the picker. You get a greater efficiency gain for new pickers than you do with existing pickers. A calm tree is what we need. So we have low vigor, low maintenance, reduced pruning, high light interception. Exposed fruit improves the accessibility and the harvestability of fruit. And the no ladders scenario, whether that's pedestrian or it's platforms, it reduces downtime, reduces workload, and increases the efficiency again. So one of the things about talking about labour efficiency, and there's a lot of discussion about jumping into platforms and using that, especially in New Zealand at the moment, and a big purchase program from a whole range of growers. One of the first things we have to deal with is the canopy to achieve these things, and then that will make platforms and other things more efficient. Ross.
So now I want to talk about, so we've got these labour objectives we've set out, and Craig's just added to that in that last slide. So now we want to turn our attention. So if we're planting new blocks, what should those blocks actually look like? What should their design be to enable us to meet these labour objectives? And interestingly, I just had a session with one of my really good clients just yesterday who's a great three-dimensional grower, growing big crops of high-quality fruit. But it was his wife that said in our conversation, we've got to change. We can't keep doing what we're doing. Otherwise, we'll be left behind and no one will want to work for us. So we talked about this, and this is what does a new block got to look like? So number one, it must be a narrow canopy with limited fruit occlusion. That means we can see most of the fruit. And what that does multiple things, but one of the things that allows us to do is to use this technology that some of it's already here, but some of it's just around the corner. And Craig will show you later, we don't think robotic harvesting is that far away. Platforms are here, but if the canopy is too thick, they don't work. Mechanical trimmers, leaf blowers for colour, and even over-row sprayers are being used in orchards in the Hawke's Bay already on apple orchards. So it must be a canopy that's ready for this new technology that's just around the corner. In Australia, really important that it must be a canopy that we can cover with hail net efficiently. The yield is a big one. We can't be growing canopies that don't have good yield, and they must be able to have what we call high yield accumulation as a young tree. You know, when you're spending as much money as we have to for a new apple orchard these days, we've got to get that yield and we've got to get it quickly. Multiple picks are very labor intensive. Let's try and grow canopies that we can get down to 2 picks maximum. So we've got better access to the fruit, we've got larger fruit, we've got higher colour fruit, and hopefully we can pick it in 2 good picks. And let's at least get ladders out of the system if we can, and we might even be able to get bags out of the system, but let's certainly get ladders out of the system. They would be some objectives that we should have for new blocks. And what I'm going to do now is just take you through some options, because the great thing about growing apples is there's quite a few ways that you can do it. And the futuristic plantings are no different. So here's the Fops canopy that's been developed in Havelock North in New Zealand and around the world. It's been led by Dr. Ben van Hooijdonk at Plant and Food Research. And there's a schematic on the left of what this canopy is. It's a cordon system with multiple upright shoots, typically about 30 centimetres apart. And you can see that schematic on the left. The picture on the right is a picture of our consultants just last week, actually, on the Royal Gala Fops block that was just about to be picked. So you can sort of see what the canopy looks like. What this video is just me walking down this Fops canopy, and you can see the small branching, you can see the light wells in it. That crop there's about 150 tonnes per hectare, and the fruit size was amazing. So these canopies can yield, and they can yield big, but that canopy is only 40 centimetres wide, which allows it to be, you know, all the things that we want from a very labour efficient canopy. So the next one is the Guyot system, which has been developed in Italy by Dr. Alberto Dorigoni, who's actually been to Australia before as one of our guests, fantastic researcher, and has recently won the European Pink Lady Innovation Award for the block of trees on the right-hand side of that picture. That's a 2.3 metre row spacing. Most of that fruit can be picked from the ground. And believe it or not, the yield on that is 131 tonnes per hectare. The picture on the left, sorry, Craig.
One of the things that really stands out to me is in these 2 pictures, you can see how harvest is much more efficient. You know, a picker going into that block is, you know, before they even get up to the tree, they know which apple they're going to pick. They're not hunting for the apple. It's right there, and that's what we mean about accessibility and reducing the choice. It just becomes an easier orchard to pick.
Yeah, absolutely easier, and he's aiming for, he's aiming for a pedestrian orchard or semi-pedestrian, very, very short ladders with high yield, and that's what he's able to achieve. The canopy on the left is Fuji in its fourth leaf doing 80 tonnes per hectare, all pickable from the ground. This is Alberto thinning that Fuji canopy. But again, what you can see here is, look how narrow that canopy is. Look how well spaced that fruit is. And that is only in its fourth leaf, doing 80 tonnes per hectare. And look how labour efficient that is. So that's a couple of examples of a couple of canopy options going forward. Very narrow, and they're both using a cordon with upright branches. So then we go to the next option, because there's multiple options, and Craig, you might want to talk about this one, because this is your baby that you've developed.
Yeah, well, it's, I mean, and I just call it's an upright 2D, and again, it's classed in a whole range of canopies. It can be called 2D, but to me, I like a horizontal branch system because it creates simpler and simpler rules. The gaps between the wires create discipline about light wells and light movement through the tree. The picture on the right with the harvestable envy there of last season, that is on a formal system and just horizontal wires, but you have a little bit of width on some of the fruiting spurs, so they hang down. So the fruit's not looking like it's sitting in a very narrow situation, but you can see just about the shade on that reflective cloth, how open that canopy is. And that was, I think, fifth leaf doing 65 to 70 tonnes.
Yeah, and that canopy and more, probably more so this one than the previous two, is all ready to go for the robotic picker when it becomes available, because a robotic picker is going to rely on a camera that can see the fruit, and you can see how that is very, very possible in a canopy such as that. But even before the robot comes, the platforms become extremely efficient, and they get, the platforms allow us to get rid of the ladders, get rid of the bags if we want to. So next one, Craig, just the final one. And this is a super spindle. This is another way of doing it. Those two photos on the left are, pruned spindle trees. One's a double leader, one's a single leader, and there you've got, that looks like it's a photo from Italy. I think it probably is, that one on the right. Super spindle, very narrow canopies. Remember, Italy, virtually all their work is done on platforms.
So then you talk about, well, I might not always be planting a new block, and I've still got 85% of my orchard in old structure or an older tree form. And so, what I'm saying is, how do we move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side? And this is actually the same orchard, just years apart. And so what we looked at here is just saying, how can we actually maintain yield, simplify the orchard for workers, and actually have greater access to it in terms of harvesting? So we started off, same orchard, we started off putting platforms in, and then you just look at the access and the fruit problems and everything else that occurs with these two different styles of platforms, the Heron from the east coast of the US and JJ's Bin Banded on the left-hand photo. But that's just not sustainable. It's just not going to work with platforms long term. So effectively what we did is we started looking at this tree design, and because of the process in terms that I sort of work on in terms of this horizontal canopy, we just looked and said, can we put in 6 horizontal wires? So we're putting in 6 branches, and so those branches, you have the trees were 1.4 meters apart, so 0.7 on either side, so you have 12 of those a tree, 8.4 meters of canopy of lineal meters. Then you have 12 branches running in the row, and you can just see, so you have one in each gap coming into the row without getting too much width, and then you've got another 6 on the other side of the canopy, 1 per gap. So you're disciplined in terms of where the branches are going and how much light's coming in. And if we look at that, it was 14, almost 15 metres per tree of fruiting wood. 1,900 trees a hectare gives us about 27 kilometres of fruiting wood. And in the other work we've done, 3 kilograms per metre of fruiting wood is very achievable. So that's 81 tonnes. And if for whatever reason we need to be 2.5 for a biennial variety, might be 67. And we have had results on high yielding varieties up as high as 3.5 kilograms per running metre, 95 tonnes. So by doing the maths and working it through, we said, yeah, this is all possible. So we just put it into action and took, changed the orchard over 3 years and effectively created an orchard that looks like this. That's an existing orchard, but we're trying to get to that same narrow, simple canopy with accessibility and simple rules around doing the job. So in thinking about this, I thought, oh, I'm really smart here. And I thought we've done something really unique. And I was going through my photo library, and lo and behold, I went back to Mark Triscoma's orchard down in Victoria. And I thought, gosh, Mark must have been a bit of a visionary. If we go back 5 or 6, 7 years, he was playing around with a 2D style structure with actually a double cordon system running off some grafted trees. So Mark was doing exactly, or is doing exactly the same thing, and converting an old orchard into a very simple, narrow, manageable orchard with high yield potential. I think if I remember rightly, at some point, Mark might be able to correct me, but this had something like 60 kilometres of fruiting wood in it, because it's a double wall with horizontal wood in each location. But again, we're taking an existing orchard and trying to create those similar objectives that we talked about earlier. The other way to think about it is just saying a tall spindle tree. Can I actually simplify my tall spindle tree? And one of the other things that we've been working on the last couple of years is just throwing really simple rules into our trees. The majority of our trees are too large and too complex. And so we're just throwing in rules like 4 branches per running metre, end of story. So many branches between wires, and then shortening those pieces of wood up and trying to come up with something that is a simpler, narrower canopy, even within a random 3-dimensional canopy, and achieving canopies that look like this. One's ambrosia and one's jazz, but still being able to have those rules about narrow, simple, accessible, and efficient to manage. So again, if we're thinking about trying to have a real dramatic impact on our efficiency and labour, we need high consistent yield, we need the simple tree, we need a calm tree, we need the fruit exposed to light, and all of that can lead towards less ladder work or no ladder work. What we want to look at now is saying, okay, so we get the canopy starting to get into shape and where we need to, and what are our technology options going forward? And I know this is my sweet spot, Ross, but jump in any time. So, mechanical pruning, this is my first foray into mechanical pruning about 5 years ago, where we just had a canopy like this, and the grower said to me, oh, look, have a go, don't worry about it. There's no fruit there, there's nothing to pick. I'm happy that you just have a crack. And I rang him back after a couple of hours and said, I think there's 72 tonnes in the canopy. And all of a sudden, just by pruning and actually mechanically pruning that and driving it, we exposed the fruit and made a huge difference. And there's a lot in mechanical pruning, and Ross has studied what some of the other work that Alberto Doragoni done is around mechanical pruning. So any comments there, Ross, about that?
I think the only thing I would put, I see this technology being very useful, and I know there's some in Australia using it now. but remember that this will work really well on an upright system where you can get access to both sides of the canopy. It's one of the things that won't work so well with a V. So, you know, Vs are certainly good options. They're extremely productive, great intercepts of light, they're narrow. But I like the uprights personally, Craig, because, and this is one technology that I want to have access, or I think our growers should have access to in the future, so they can get to both sides of the canopy in exactly the same way.
If we move on to other options, so a leaf blowing. So this is probably now 3rd year, I think, that we've been working on the new systems for leaf blowing in orchards, and I know Plunkett orchards have been using the red pulse for 2 seasons, I think now. And effectively, when you're leaf blowing, as you can see on the photos on the right, you're actually shattering leaves, you're breaking them up, and you're creating much more exposure to the fruit to light. Now, what's this got to do with efficiency in terms of that? Isn't it just about creating a higher colour fruit, which is better? If you come back to labour efficiency, if I get fruit colour, I can pick the fruit when I want and how I want. If we're sitting there waiting for colour and the accessibility to the fruit is poorer, then we're struggling to pick efficiency through the canopy. So I think leaf blowers, it's now 3 years. There's more and more leaf blowers being bought every year, and I think it's just a technology that's been taken out of grapes and now into apples, and I think it's going to be here to stay. Here's an example out of Italy that when we were studying it, one of my R&D managers been over to Italy a couple of times and worked at Limeberg and comparing the 2 systems. So on the left-hand side, a leaf-blown canopy, and on the right-hand side, a canopy untouched. And then again, you can just imagine how much more efficient that canopy would be in terms of harvest with leaf blowing, as well as all the other quality advantages of a higher coloured fruit. There has been in the past some limited amount of manual leaf stripping on Pink Lady in Australia and New Zealand and a couple of other varieties. But with a mechanical leaf blower, you can cover more ground more efficiently and get through the whole canopy if you need to, top to bottom. So then we come to platforms. And, you know, again, I think the last 12 months in New Zealand there's been more platforms purchased, Ross, than in the last 10 years, I think.
Absolutely.
It's just gone nuts. And people are making all sorts of decisions in all sorts of crazy ways, but they realise they've got to do something, and they're massive investments. This is just a picture out of Washington. I think if you zoomed out on that drone shot, there was something like 22 platforms in this particular orchard working, which seems a bit ridiculous and that, but it's a way of getting across the ground, getting fruit off much quicker, much faster with a limited workforce. And when you look at all the numbers, you know, efficiency, you know, these are studies that have done by Karen Lewis 3, 5, 6 years ago. So everything in terms of platforms, when you're running in a platform efficiently, there's these significant positive gains in terms of worker efficiency. Now, it's not to mean the photo I've got there is one of automated Ags machines, Bin Bandit. And I remember this was in the spring, a couple of months later, which was last harvest, that machine went into the orchard and was parked up for 2 days because the whole structure of picking needs to change. You need to think about how you're managing people differently. It's not just a matter of putting a platform into an orchard and saying, go to it. To get the real efficiency out of platforms, it takes a lot of understanding and change in the way we work with people. But one thing, I think, Ross, you had the example the other day of one of your growers ringing you up who just recently purchased a platform around this less training and getting up to speed.
Yeah, so what they were noticing was the professional picker, if you like, wasn't any quicker, but to bring in people who haven't done it before, It was just so much quicker to bring them up to a reasonable output. Almost on a ladder and a bag, it was almost totally unsustainable, Craig. They just couldn't do it. But put them on a platform and they were quite effective labour units.
Yeah, and I think, the whole platform debate, we could I've got a slide later on with 5 or 6 different platforms on, and you think, oh God, there's a myriad of different options here. But I sort of break them into 2 camps. You've got a conveyor type system where you've got a fixed position, and generally, apart from the guy in the foreground on the right-hand side carrying a bag, most of them aren't carrying bags. And so they're just placing fruit onto a conveyor system. There's no weight and everything else, but they're in a fixed position, which is very hard to, there's no flexibility in that particular system. And on the right-hand side, you have a platform where there's a lot of movement. You've got a height position, but you can move up and down. And at the high level and the low level in that platform, you can cross over. So if there's a workload on one side of the alleyway, you can move across and do that as well. And the other thing about them, the platform on the left-hand side is focusing on only picking the tops, and the platform on the right is trying to pick the whole tree. So there's these 2 styles of platforms, and there's 2 camps around what people are trying to achieve with their platforms and how they do with it. And it's there's a lot of thinking and a lot of decision making around which platform best fits a business. If you're really trying to get a return on capital and you're trying to you're really pushed in terms of getting fruit off at the right time, night picking is really possible. So this particular orchard was running 2 full shifts, so 7 till 4, 4 to midnight, I think. So there's full LED lights on a lot of the machines. These are Galaxy machines. You also have, the guys have a head torch just in terms of looking into the bin and doing QC work and things like that. But night picking opens up a whole lot of other options, and you just can't imagine night picking with a head torch with a ladder. The H&S issues and everything else could be, quite problematic. Then you come back to this whole thing about which platform I'm going to choose, and there's all sorts of different options and all sorts of iterations, and from fully commercial and to some really awesome home-built options as well. If we think about platforms, here's just a few ideas that I just threw down. You've got to think about scale, the cost in terms of what it's doing, and the cost. One of my clients just bought 2 machines and they'll buy 2 more next year, and they realize that one machine hasn't got the efficiency that 2 have, and gaining more efficiency by having 4 machines. But again, that links into scale. Maintenance, I like a simple machine. The conveyor belt machines need a high level of maintenance and everything else, which is all possible. But the more complex the machine, the more specialist skills you need and all those sorts of things. The other one is about people working together and not apart. So previously, if we've got ladders, you're dealing with a one-to-one relationship, training and QC and influencing that picker. But when you talk about machines, you're dealing with 1 to 6, 1 to 8. So it's quite a different dynamic in terms of how you mix and relate to staff. And that takes quite a different skill than the one-to-one relationship. I've got a number of growers who just think the platform's awesome, but they've got 60-metre row runs. So 20% of their time is turning at the end of the row. So when you're designing an orchard, row length comes into it. Tree structure, we've gone into that at length. Bin management, some of these platforms have the ability to bring bins with them and transfer empty and full bins on a trailer system. Others, you still have to lay out bins in your orchard. Conveyors versus small bags or no bags. So you've got different options in the physical nature in terms of what you're trying to do. And this thing about whether you're trying to just create efficiency by picking the tops or you're trying to pick the whole tree. And so all of these things come into the mix. And probably the one I haven't put in there is saying, well, actually, a lot of the time, the platform you buy is the one your neighbour bought because you can see the experience and you can see something. And quite often what we see is that a similar platform is bought in clusters by location, and it's more that they've just built up experience and sharing knowledge about how to use it, how to manage it. But looking at this whole thing, what's the next level? If we're going to platforms, the top left is Tavel out of Israel. They have autonomous drones picking apples. And that technology is working at the moment. You can see a tether in there, but that tether is just for a power supply based on the down to the bin. And they work in a fleet of 2 to 4 per bin, and the bin can go autonomously down the road. The next one, and so that's very close in terms, and it looks crazy in terms of what's happening. You've got the FF robotics machine on the right hand at the top. So there's a whole lot of iterations there, and that's building into a commercial model with automated ag, where they're modular putting that particular robot onto one of their existing banded machines. And so they're partnering up. They're going through, they've had a bit of a stall with COVID, but they're coming into, they'll come into the US harvest season with full commercial trials running this year. The bottom left is Abundant Robotics, which has gone through more commercial trials in the Northern Hemisphere. They couldn't get to the Southern Hemisphere this year, but they've got enough results now that they're saying that they will go into limited commercial release in 2021 in the US, and then consider the development in terms of globally from there. But they're picking efficiently, they're picking at a quality level that's equal to people, and they feel very comfortable with where they're at in terms of that technology. And the other machine on the bottom right-hand side is a cyclone. So it's a picker assist machine. So it's a series of, it's an octopus type scenario where you have a very simple belt with a vacuum tube, and that vacuum tube's taking the fruit back to a bin filler on the machine. So that's also in partnership with Automated Ag out of Moses Lake. And so they're looking at that as a modular unit, which is just about picker assist rather than being robotically autonomous. We will see commercial picking with robotics within 2 years. And so again, it reinforces that if we think that's where we need to be, then we need to put the foot on the accelerator and get our canopies and our tree management prepared for what's coming. And I believe we can do all of that and not actually reduce or have any reduction in our yield or our quality stakes, but potentially increase them.
Okay, so just finally, we want to address the other objective, which is becoming an employer of choice. And look at the 6 people working that system there. I reckon they'd be pretty happy in their work. Beautiful crop, nice narrow canopy, great platform, no ladders, no bags. So what are we going to do to achieve this state? Well, we've got to have simple trees with fruit in easy reach. We've got to take away the ladder work. It's too hard. We've got to take it away as much as we can. We've got to take away the heavy bags. We've got to make the work easier and less physical. Picking apples is, it's challenging, and to get a person doing it right, it's a skill. They should be well-paid people. So they want to keep coming back every year. And if we can create that team environment, we're going to be all the better for attracting our workforce back every year. That's the end of this presentation, and now either Craig or myself are available for your questions and any feedback. Thank you.